Tier lists are everywhere in the Genshin Impact community. Whether it be something as straightforward as who your favorites are, to something as silly as ranking the Genshin characters as Genshin players. If you can think of it, there's likely a tier list for it. And most of them are entirely for fun, and they're just matters of opinion at the end of the day. But there's one very common type of tier list that isn't quite as inconsequential, that being the meta tier list. These tier lists aim to rank the game's roster based on how strong they are, most often in the context of Floor 12 of the Spiral Abyss. The reason I say these aren't as inconsequential as the others is because players look to these tier lists to determine which characters they should pull for and build. While they can be a helpful resource for players, they're often misleading and, in my view, not the most helpful way of guiding players' investment. It's worth mentioning that these meta tier lists can be made for fun, just like any other type of tier list. While I will be challenging the notion that they're as useful as they're often assumed to be, if you are interested in making, viewing, or discussing meta tier lists because it's enjoyable for you, then that's great. Keep doing that. I enjoy them myself, but I think it's important to be aware of their flaws and limitations if you want to use them to advise yourself or others. To begin, however, I want to discuss the merits of tier lists. They're popular for a reason, after all. The fact is that some characters are simply stronger than others. We may have disagreements over whether or not Yelan or Xingqiu is better, but both are undoubtedly superior to Hydro Traveler. But for new players who are neither familiar with many of the game's mechanics nor the kits of most characters, they may be unsure as to whether they should invest into Hydro Traveler or Xingqiu. A tier list is a simple way to convey which characters are stronger, and thus worth spending your valuable resin and primogems on. So simple that you could know almost nothing about the game and still know which characters to build. Genshin has a very complex elemental reaction system on top of a multitude of other combat mechanics that may be unclear or unintuitive to new players. And on top of that, there is a vast array of characters to consider. This can make it quite overwhelming to know who to invest into, and meta tier lists provide help with this with minimal effort. You don't need to learn about elemental reactions, team building, synergies, and what each character does. You can just look at a tier list, see that Bennett is in S tier, and build him. Tier lists can also be a jumping off point for further discussion. For example, an argument over whether or not Xingqiu or Yelan is better could be quite informative, as it could teach people about Xingqiu's damage reduction, faster Hydro application, and longer duration, versus Yelan's higher damage output and shorter cooldowns, as well as her buff. And it can highlight how impactful something like Xingqiu's C6 or Yelan's C2 are. A tier list itself doesn't actually present these nuances about Xingqiu and Yelan's respective strengths and weaknesses, but simply places them in a category designed to highlight how strong they are. The main issue here is that a character's overall strength within the meta says a lot less about how valuable they will be to a player's individual account compared to actually gaining that understanding of what they do and where their synergies lie. Consider one account that has Nilou and another that has Neuvillette, and Nahida and Kazuha are the two rerunning characters at the time. A tier list would probably put both of these characters at the top, and the player wouldn't know which one to go for. But for the Nilou, however, Nahida is probably the better pull, whereas it is likely Kazuha for the Neuvillette haver. Similarly, when deciding which of their characters to invest into, Barbara and Collei would be some great recommendations for the Nilou haver. And yet, a player just looking at a tier list would dismiss these two, who usually wind up ranking low, causing them to neglect building characters that could have been a great help to their account. Whether or not these characters are truly, say, C tier, as many tier lists claim them to be, is up for debate. But whether or not you should build them has nothing to do with that, but rather it has to do with if they will help your account, or if they're just fun, or you like them, but, that's besides the point of this video. And for many Nilou players, Barbara and Collei will be great help to their account. Additionally, Most characters' strength will vary greatly depending on which other characters you have or are building, and what constellations you have on these characters, what weapons your account has, and stuff like this. These nuances can't be captured by a tier list, unless said tier list was personalized to your own account's situation. Many tier lists will assume that you have certain characters like Furina, Nahida, or Kazuha, but as limited 5 stars, it is not fair to assume every account will have these. Not to mention, some people might not want to play these characters. Additionally, older 4 stars are often assumed to be C6. Certain constellations can be very impactful to your account. Xiangling C4, Fischl C6, Xingqiu C6. Not having these can carry quite heavy implications on not just the ranking of these characters themselves, but the ranking of others too. Child, for instance, is at his best when played in a team with Bennett, Kazuha, and Xiangling. For those who do not have Kazuha, or whose Xiangling does not have her 4th constellation, the team performs considerably worse. Another example is Fischl's C6, considerably boosting her damage, which is especially significant in aggravate teams where she makes up a pretty big portion of the overall team damage, meaning that characters who perform best in aggravate teams, such as Kuching or Clorand, are not as good if you don't have Fischl's C6. There are countless examples of characters' strength being dependent on your roster. Genshin is a game that's all about team synergies. Your options for teammates play a huge role in how good a character will be. There's also the inherent subjectivity of meta tier lists. We tend to think of meta as objective because, it's not just based on which characters you like the most or whatever, but the way in which we choose to evaluate what makes a character good or bad in the meta comes down to making a lot of subjective decisions. For example, how should we weigh the value of a character that provides a lot of comfort, potentially at the expense of DPS, such as Zhongli, versus the value of a character like Linny, who is capable of achieving very high DPS, but it's very difficult to do so? There isn't an objective right or wrong answer, as it all comes down to the preferences of the player and how much they're willing to sweat over the game. There's also the consideration of power versus versatility. C6 Farazan, for instance, is extremely strong on Animo hypercarry teams, such as those of Zhao and Wanderer, but nothing special outside of them. Meanwhile, Kokomi is great in Ayaka Freeze, Nilou Bloom, Furina Monohydro, Furina Taser, just to name a few. But she's much more replaceable on these teams than C6 Farazan is in the Animo hypercarry teams. While not having C6 Farazan is a pretty big hit to the strength of Animo hypercarry teams, there are many great alternatives to Kokomi, such as Furina or Mona for Freeze, Barbara for Nilou and Taser, etc. For players who like to play many teams, they may value Kokomi more highly, whereas players who prefer to focus on a smaller number of more highly invested teams may consider C6 Farazan to be the more valuable unit. Once again, there is no objective right or wrong here, it's just a matter of preference. There are many other considerations, such as how easy a character is to build, how replaceable they are, or how different playstyles may be easier or harder for certain players, and how important each of these factors is, and how they should all be weighed is highly subjective. There's nothing inherently wrong with this subjectivity. There's a lot of nuance to the process of evaluating how good a character is, and personally, I think that's part of what makes the game so interesting, and what makes discussing tier lists and discussing meta so fun. But where it becomes a problem is that these tier lists often, implicitly or explicitly, are portrayed as objective, erasing all of this nuance. Some tier lists will list certain assumptions that are made, especially when it comes to constellation levels of characters, but the rest of these subjective preferences are almost always left unclarified. And while it is possible for a tier list to state many of their subjective assumptions, which would be great, a tier list based on one set of subjective assumptions ignores the perspective of other assumptions, and that doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but it does limit its usefulness, as most other people will not share the same assumptions, though this is, of course, better than leaving the assumptions unstated. And an attempt to make a tier list that puts characters in all sorts of different places to account for all the various possibilities in terms of who you have and what your preferences are would be a convoluted mess. Put simply, tier lists aren't designed for this level of nuance. So far, this situation seems pretty bad for players looking for who to build and pull for, but fortunately, there are other much better ways to figure this out, such as character guides. Many character guides discuss good team comps and teammates for the character in question, so players interested in playing that character can figure out which other characters they should build or pull for to go with them. There are also many should you pull videos that come out when a new banner drops, which can go deeper into the nuances of the strengths, weaknesses, and synergies of the current rate-up characters to help you decide whether they're right for you and your account's situation. Essentially, knowing what a character does is far more important to your success in this game than knowing how good they are. Consider looking for guides for your favorite characters, or whichever you're most interested in playing, especially out of the ones you already own. And after learning more about them, you can get a better idea for the direction you want to take your account in. For example, if your favorite character is Diluc, you may want to focus on pulling for and building characters like Farina, Shenyun, Xingqiu, Yalan, or Bennett. Not because these characters are high tier, though they are, but rather because they synergize well with Diluc in particular, especially Shenyun. While tier lists may not be entirely useless, they can be very misleading when it comes to deciding what to do with your account. If you are going to look at a meta tier list, think of it as more of a rough guideline rather than specific advice. It should not be your main resource on determining how to build a powerful account. And if you're posting a tier list yourself, it's best to consider it as more of a jumping off point for discussion rather than a guide in and of itself. And know that why a character gets a particular ranking is a lot more important than what that ranking is. What do you think? Do you agree with my perspective on tier lists, or do you think they have more merit than I give them credit for? And have there been any times where investing into a lower tier character was the right choice for your account, or a higher tier character was the wrong one? Be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you found this video enjoyable or insightful, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more videos. Until next time.